On World Environment Day, we'll be taking a look at China's reaffirmation of its commitments on climate change as some American states break ranks with the president's decision to reject the Paris Climate Accord. And as the U.S. again lambasts China for its so-called militarization of the South China Sea, I'll be asking whether Donald Trump's Asia-Pacific policy is likely to raise tensions with Beijing. Welcome to The Point. I'm Liu Xin. We start with a look at the situation in London. 3 terrorist attacks in 3 months. It seems one of the safest capitals in the world is quickly finding itself having to live with the fact that small-scale, lone wolf-style attacks against soft targets could become a rather disturbing new normal. Prime Minister Theresa May vowed enough is enough and pledged to fight against tolerance towards extremism, including stopping the spread of extremist ideology online and tougher punishment for terrorist offences. But she did not mention any actions to address the deeper reasons behind these terrorist attacks. Before the latest attack in London, it was the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn who pointed out the connection between the UK's military intervention in places like Iraq, Afghanistan and Syria with the terrorist attacks on its home soil. Corbyn said an informed understanding of the causes of terrorism is an essential part of an effective response that fights rather than fuels terrorism. And he said Britons must be brave enough to admit the war on terror is simply not working. He said we need a smarter way to reduce the threat from countries that nurture terrorists and generate terrorism. Now, Corbyn's view was, of course, immediately criticised as being outrageous and ill-judged by the Conservative Party. Unfortunately, when the current foreign policy remains coupled with domestic social issues such as polarisation and poor integration of Muslim immigrants, the British people could be seeing the beginning of more similar attacks in the future. Now, turning to another topic, Monday marks this year's World Environment Day. By choosing the theme of connecting people to nature, the UN is calling on people around the world to take forward the call to protect the earth we share. Just last week, however, US President Donald Trump did quite the opposite when he said America would be pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Yet the collective response of determination and mobilization from US's states have offered us a silver lining. In the wake of Trump's decision, the governors of California, Washington and New York have agreed to form an alliance aimed at meeting America's climate change goals. Meanwhile, China is moving forward with its endeavors in saving energy and reducing emissions. The country is to put into effect its first law on environmental protection tax at the beginning of next year. How important is such a law, as well as efforts to meet climate change goals, despite Trump's decision to exit the Paris Accord? Joining me in Beijing is Professor Zhou Ji from the Harbin Institute of Technology. Professor Zhou, thank you very much for joining me today. Now, in 2015, you were personally involved in the negotiation of the Paris Agreement as a Chinese expert within the delegation. You witnessed the historic birth of that agreement. From your personal perspective, how did you react when you heard about President Trump's decision to pull out of this agreement?
Yeah, actually, I'm fully surprised and also very, very disappointing for this incorrect decision from President Trump. I think this is something against the historic and the whole world's trends. So this is totally a mistake.
Why, with the kind of justification that President Trump quoted for his decision, for instance, that this is going to cost the United States a lot of money, a lot of jobs, and that climate change is the hoax?
No way, because I think President Trump's judgment is totally wrong. Why? Because this is something out of the time. Now, for today's world, when the technological revolution, when the new ideas of new views on development, we can see consistency between environmental protection and the economic development. In fact, they are two sides of the one coin. And we can find the commercial opportunities and the new engine of economic growth by environmental protection, by climate mitigation and adaptation.
I'm just joined from Boston by Mr. Frank Ackerman, who is the principal economist at Synapse Energy Economics, a public interest-oriented consulting firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Mr. Ackerman, thank you very much for joining us. Now, President Trump believed that the Paris Agreement will cause job losses and have a negative economic impact on the United States. But in your book, Can We Afford the Future?, you brought up quite the opposite argument. How do you look at whether or not the decision by President Trump is wise or not in an economic sense?
There are all sorts of criteria other than economic which enter the decision about whether it's wise or not, but the idea of job loss from climate policies is almost certainly mistaken. It's been studied repeatedly by many research groups. I led a study about 2 years ago. Over and over again, these studies find that there will be substantial net job gains from renewable energy, from energy efficiency. These are very job-intensive activities. Many of the jobs, the construction jobs in installing these measures, have to be done on site. So it is very hard to see any realistic way that the United States loses jobs on balance from clean energy.
Now, looking for allies to fight climate change, California Governor Jerry Brown headed to China together with his counterparts from Washington and New York in a push to build foreign support for carbon-cutting efforts. What could be done in the state level in the United States, and does the federal government pullout make it more difficult for such actions in the state level?
The federal decision certainly makes it more difficult, but there is a lot that states can do. A lot of energy regulation is done at the state level. California has adopted its own vehicle emission standards, and some number of other states have signed on to the California standards. I think we could see the states that care about this, which are quite a large part of the United States, taking action together. I calculated that if the states that were solidly opposed to Trump were a separate country, they would be the 5th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, larger than any country in Europe. So it's a substantial group if they ally and stay in tune with the rest of the world on these issues.
Professor Zhou, in China now, the National People's Congress has passed China's first environmental protection tax law in a bid to strengthen the enforcement of environmental regulations. For instance, under the new law, entities will be taxed accordingly for noise, pollution. Companies producing contaminations will pay taxes up to $1,650 per month. It also set rates for stipulated quantities of air and water pollutants, and up to $150 for each ton of solid waste, and so on and so forth. How important is this law in China's fight against climate change, and what message is sent by such legislation?
I think that's a very important step towards more environmentally friendly institutional capacity building, so that send the message to have incentive to stakeholders, especially the emitting enterprises, to compare their abatement cost and the tax rate, and in general, they would make more efforts on environmental protection to avoid paying tax. In that way, we have economic incentives to make them protect the environment based on their market behavior.
Mr. Ackerman, I wonder what would be the experience in the United States in terms of such environmental tax. How has such tax could work for the efforts in mitigating the effects of greenhouse emissions? In China, for instance, this is the first, but there are also some economic impact that are being argued. For instance, people are already talking about extra high tax rates in China. Could this tax put even more burden on companies while they absolutely need more competitiveness?
I think it depends on what is done with the revenues and what other policies accompany it. If you simply make it harder for one business to operate and do nothing else, perhaps there's some risk. If you tax pollution and spend the money on cleaner sources of energy, on cleaner industries, you will almost certainly create jobs as well as, of course, enjoying cleaner air and water.
Mr. Zhou, how do you look at this issue when these companies are already claiming that the taxes are too high? Will this new environmental tax put extra burden on the Chinese companies?
I think that's a matter of restructuring of the tax system. In fact, for the moment, as the first steps, this is a transition from the previous emission levy, emission fee, into environmental tax. And furthermore, I believe this is a matter of restructuring tax. That means on some areas the tax burden becomes higher, and meanwhile in other areas the tax burden becomes lower. And as an overall effect, the overall tax burden will be neutral, and this will make the comparative price of the factor inputs into the economy adjusted. That means environmental pollution will be much more expensive because of the scarcity of environmental quality.
Now, Mr. Ackerman, let's talk about some other aspect here. One of the claims Trump used to justify his decision is that climate change is a lie and there will be just a tiny temperature decrease even if the U.S. stays within the Paris Agreement. Is there any scientific evidence for what he said, or is he just missing the point that aiming at a 0.2 degree decrease now is just the thin end of the wedge and that targets will build on these first steps?
I think that the Paris agreements together accomplish more than 0.02. Maybe that's the effect of the U.S. contribution alone, but the whole point is that if everyone cooperates, we can create some momentum. And yes, more needs to be done, but the science on this is absolutely clear. It's the best researched scientific problem in human history, and the opinions of experts are something like 3,000 to 5 is my sense. And if Trump and some of his allies want to continue quoting those 5 guys, they can, but the rest of the world has moved on. We know that this is necessary.
Mr. Zhou, how will the international community achieve the target of keeping the global average temperature from rising 2 degrees Celsius compared to temperatures of the pre-industrial revolution era by the end of this century, when the world's second largest emitter has walked away from its responsibility?
So the essential approach and to innovate new development path means to change energy mix. To introduce more and more non-fossil fuel, and secondly, to improve the efficiency of energy and the production, and thirdly, to make the economy rely on knowledge and technology more. In institutional terms, we set up the bottom-up target. We call it nationally determined contribution in the context of the Paris Agreement. And then in a period, on a period basis, we can review the performance and the progress to do global stock take. And based on that, we consider how to enhance the ambition and to adjust the, to enhance the targets. In that way, I believe human beings, we can achieve higher and higher, and finally we go to our mid-century targets to reduce emission and to protect the climate.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. That was Zhou Ji from the Harbin Institute of Technology and Mr. Frank Ackerman, Principal Economist at the Synapse Energy Economics based in Boston. Now, you are watching The Point on CGTN. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. Stay with us. According to China's foreign ministry, the United States has again made irresponsible speeches against China's so-called militarization of islands in the South China Sea. At the annual Asia-Pacific Security Meeting in Singapore, known as the Shangri-La Dialogue, U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis accused China of militarizing artificial islands and enforcing excessive maritime claims unsupported by international law. He also said that the U.S. remains steadfastly committed to working with Taiwan to provide it with the defense articles it needs. What's the message he wanted to send, stirring up tensions on the South China Sea when the situation there has been calming down? And how will Mattis's remarks impact U.S. relations with China and its allies in the region? I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Mr. Zhang Junshe, Vice President of the China Naval Research Institute. But before we go into the discussion, let's hear how the leader of the Chinese delegation, He Lei, refuted Mattis's remarks on the U.S.'s freedom of navigation operations and the U.S.'s idea of building a rule-based order.
When we talk about rules, I think international rules should reflect the general between different countries, and the rules should not be unilaterally interpreted or decided upon by certain countries. Regional rules should also reflect the common interests and benefits of the countries in the region. For instance, the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea and the South China Sea Code of Conduct Framework Agreement are exactly the right kinds of consensus reached between China and Southeast Asian nations.
Mr. Zhang, thank you very much for joining us in the studio today. First of all, how do you look at the important messages coming out of Secretary Mattis's speech this time?
Well, I think his remarks at the Shangri-La Dialogue can, to some extent, reflect the new Asia-Pacific policy, which will be implemented by the Trump administration.
Can we see a very clear picture? What is the new Asia-Pacific policy under President Trump? Is it a continuation of Mr. Obama's pivot to Asia?
We didn't see a clear and comprehensive outline put forward by Mr. Mattis at the conference about the U.S. new Asia-Pacific policy. But we can see through his remarks some key elements in the future Asia-Pacific policy. First, I think is that the United States will continue to cooperate with China in some regional and international issues, including the Korean Peninsula issue. And at the same time, the new administration will continue to maintain and strengthen its alliances with its allies, including Japan and Australia. But the new administration will call for these allies to share more economic burden with the United States for the deployment of the U.S. troops in these countries. And third, I think the new administration will continue to use the maritime disputes in this region, including the South China Sea and the East China Sea maritime disputes, and also the Taiwan issue as tools to contain China.
What is special about what Mr. Mattis mentioned as the rules-based order? First of all, is it something new, and what is his intention by bringing this up?
Well, actually, the word rule-based order is not the first time to be put forward by the United States side. We remember that during last year's Shangri-La Dialogue, the former Secretary of Defense of the United States, Mr. Carter, first put forward this idea of the so-called rule-based order. So speaking about the rules, so we insist that no matter international rules or regional rules should be established or set up by the majority of the countries, not by one country, the United States, or a small group of countries like the United States, Japan, and its allies, Australia. It should be accepted by a majority of the countries in this region and the world at large. So talking about rules, actually the United States hasn't ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the UNCLOS, and also Australia has exited from the UNCLOS in 2002. So I think these two countries have no qualifications to comment on the so-called rules or the rule-based order. First, they should ratify and accept this UNCLOS, which has been ratified by over 150 countries in the world.
Now, on May the 18th, China and ASEAN countries have come to an initial framework for the Code of Conduct, a joint effort to build a peaceful environment in the South China Sea. However, Secretary Mattis mentioned in his speech that China is showing contempt for the interests of South China Sea. How is it possible that the United States failed to recognize China's and the regional countries' efforts in this regard?
Well, obviously, the United States has turned a blind eye and deaf ear to the development in the South China Sea situation. We can see that ever since last July, all the claimants in the South China Sea dispute, including the Philippines, have agreed to return to the appropriate way of negotiations to peacefully settle the South China Sea disputes. And China have worked out with ASEAN countries the framework of the COC, the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. And also, China and the Philippines have concluded their first meeting on the South China Sea issue, on the bilateral mechanism. So the United States should see that the situation in this area has calmed down. But under such circumstances, the United States still sent its warships to the South China Sea to conduct the so-called freedom of navigation, which severely provoked or challenged and endangered China's security and sovereignty.
So it's really intentional blindness to how should I say, to serve their own interest in this region.
Yes.
I want to talk a little bit about Taiwan as well, because Secretary Mattis mentioned Taiwan, but he did not mention the 3 joint communiques, which has always been the cornerstone of the U.S.'s One China policy. But he mentioned its domestic law, the Taiwan Relations Act. How do you look at this choice of wording in his speech?
Well, this is the first time for the Secretary of Defense of the United States to put forward the Taiwan issue as Shangri-La dialogue. So this is astonishing to many people, many countries in the world. I think Mr. Mattis' remarks are totally irresponsible, because we know that the Taiwan Relations Act is an internal law, domestic law of the United States. It should not override the 3 joint communiques reached by the 2 countries. Actually, these 3 joint communiques can be looked as or taken as international agreements between 2 countries. This is a political commitment of the United States government. So Mr. Mattis should adhere to the 3 joint communiques reached by the 2 countries.
When President Trump said they will abide by the One China policy, is it implied, is it implied that the 3 joint communiques would be respected as well?
Yes. Absolutely.
So why do you think he has chosen to bring up this issue and defends the United States sale of arms to Taiwan? And at the same time, he also said that confrontation between China and the United States is not inevitable. What messages is he trying to send? Meanwhile, the United States also need China to work on the DPRK issue, right?
Yes. Mr. Mattis' remarks all cover 2 aspects. On one hand, the United States wants to cooperate with China on some regional issues, including the Korean Peninsula issue. Actually, I think this issue is an issue between the United States and North Korea. And on the other hand, we can see that the United States still wants to use the Taiwan issue, as a tool to contain China.
So looking further, how do you see the development of the US's Asia-Pacific policy, especially while Mattis is promising heavy presence of the US military, especially US Navy presence in this part of the world? Is this going to be, are they putting extra resources? Are they putting Asia-Pacific as a greater point of importance for them strategically, or pretty much continuation of the existing policy?
Although publicly the United States new government, new administration has said that it has given up the strategy of pivoting to the Asia-Pacific or the rebalancing in the Asia-Pacific strategy or policy carried out by the Obama administration. But we can see that still the United States attaches great importance to the geostrategic position of the Asia-Pacific region. So it will still deploy over about 60% of its naval and air assets in this region. So with this kind of deployment in this region, so we can see, and we have seen that the U.S. military has sent its warships to the South China Sea to conduct the so-called freedom of navigation, which which provoke tensions in this area. So in the future, I don't think this is a good phenomenon to see for us to see the United States to deploy over half of its military warships and aircraft to this area. This will provoke tensions in this area.
At the same time, they're also counting on China to resolve the DPRK issue. So indeed, it's an impossible situation, right? On the one hand, you contain, on the other hand, you can engage. You want something and you don't want to give away. You know, you want China to do something, and meanwhile, you're bashing China for doing some other things. This is a kind of an impossible situation. But
yes.
Yeah, one sentence, please.
Yes, but the Korean Peninsula issue actually is an issue between the United States and North Korea. These two countries lack strategic trust in each other.
So, thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Mr. Zhang Jingshe, Vice President of the China Naval Research Institute. And briefly, this is my point here. It's clear the Trump administration believes in hard power instead of soft power. The use of Scud missiles, for instance, and the mother of all bombs, together with the retreat from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Paris Climate Accord, clearly show the Trump administration's preference for simplistic solutions. But life is never that simple, and the days when might is right are dying, and people need to wake up to that. Politicians could get some short-term benefits to help them stay in power, but the decay of such a mentality and the decline of countries that hold such a mentality is a trend that cannot be stopped. Thanks for watching. As always, follow me on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. I'm Liu Xin. Thanks for watching. You got the point.